The photograph arrived on a Tuesday morning in September 1944, sealed in a weathered envelope that bore the official stamps of the United States Army. Margaret Sullivan held it with trembling fingers, afraid to open it, as if the act of looking might somehow make the moment more real. Through the kitchen window of her modest home in Cleveland, Ohio, the autumn sun filtered through yellowing curtains, casting amber light across the formica table where she sat alone. Her husband, James, had been gone for nearly 2 years. 2 years of waiting, of rationing, of listening to radio broadcasts with her heart lodged in her throat, searching for any mention of his regiment. And now this envelope. When she finally gathered the courage to slide the photograph from its paper sleeve, her breath caught. It was James, unmistakably James, standing in some distant place she could not name, surrounded by 5 other soldiers in uniform. His arm was draped around a young private with kind eyes, and his smile was radiant. Not the dutiful posed smile she had seen in photographs before he deployed. This was different. This was the smile she remembered from their wedding day, from the moment he held their firstborn daughter, from quiet evenings when they would sit on their porch and watch the world turn golden. His smile held a lightness she hadn't expected to see again in a soldier's face. Margaret traced her finger across his face, feeling the texture of the glossy paper beneath her fingertip. Something about that smile unsettled her. It was so full of life, so genuine, that it seemed to belong to a man who had already made peace with something. She turned the photograph over, hoping for a date, a location, any clue that might tell her when this image had been captured. On the back, in familiar handwriting, a message. September 10th, 1944. The fellas and I before the push. Don't worry, Maggie. I promise I'll come home. September 10th. Today was September 18th. 8 days had passed since James had looked into that camera lens with such profound peace in his eyes. Margaret set the photograph on the table and stared at it for what felt like hours, unable to shake the feeling that she was looking at a man who was already saying goodbye. The smile, so full of life and hope, suddenly seemed fragile, precious, like something captured just moments before it might shatter forever. She thought of her 2 daughters asleep upstairs, Catherine, aged 6, and little Emma, only 3. They barely remembered their father. Catherine kept a drawing she'd made of him on her bedroom wall, a stick figure with a large heart. Emma would ask sometimes, "When's Daddy coming home?" And Margaret never knew what to say. But James had promised. Right there on the back of that photograph, in ink that seemed to glow with sincerity, he had promised he would come home. That evening, Margaret showed the photograph to her mother, who had come to help with the children while she worked at the ammunition factory. Her mother's face grew pale as she examined it. "He looks so happy," she whispered, and the way she said it, with such finality, terrified Margaret. It was the same tone her mother had used when Margaret's father had passed 3 years earlier. It was the tone of someone who recognized a goodbye when she saw one. Margaret tried to laugh it off, but that night she couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, clutching the photograph to her chest, aware that somewhere far away, in places she could not imagine, the world was tearing itself apart. And the man she loved more than life itself was standing in the middle of it all, smiling. James Patrick Sullivan had always been the kind of man who could find light in darkness. Growing up in a cramped tenement in Boston's North End, he had learned early that survival required more than just physical strength. It required hope. His father had worked the docks, his mother had taken in laundry, and James had been the eldest of 7 children. By necessity, he became a protector, a provider, a source of laughter when money ran out before the month did. He had met Margaret at a church social in 1936, and it had felt like destiny. She was a school teacher with golden hair and a quiet strength that matched his own. Within a year, they were married. Within 3 years, Catherine was born. They had built a small, beautiful life in Cleveland, saving every penny, dreaming of a bigger house, more children, a future that seemed limitless. James worked at the steel mill, Margaret taught school, and on weekends, they would take walks along Lake Erie, holding hands, speaking about the world they would build together. Then came December 1941, and everything changed. Pearl Harbor shattered their plans like glass. James was patriotic, as were so many men of his generation. But Margaret remembered the night he received his draft notice. He sat in their kitchen, the same kitchen where she would later sit holding his photograph, and wept. Not from fear, though fear was certainly there. He wept because he was leaving behind everything that made him human. He was leaving behind Margaret's laugh, Catherine's small hand in his, the smell of Margaret's cooking, the sound of church bells on Sunday morning. "I have to do this," he had told her, pulling her close. "For them, for all of them." and she understood. Though understanding didn't make the pain any less sharp. The training had been grueling. Fort Jackson in South Carolina in the summer of 1942 had tested him in ways he never imagined. He came home on leave in December, thinner, harder, but his eyes still held that light, still held that love. He had held Catherine, who barely recognized him, and walked Emma around the house, singing softly. With Margaret, he had been tender, careful, as if he might break her if he held too tightly. The European theater had called in early 1943. James had been assigned to the 29th Infantry Division, a unit formed from National Guard units across the United States. He was promoted to sergeant, leading a squad of young men barely out of high school, boys who looked to him for strength and guidance. He took the responsibility seriously. His letters home spoke of training, of the cold barracks, of friendships formed in adversity. He never spoke of fear, though Margaret knew it was there. She could read it between the lines of his careful words. By 1944, the United States Army had become his entire world. Margaret saw it in his photographs, the tautness of his jaw, the weariness in his eyes. Somewhere in his transformation from steel mill worker to soldier, James had lost some essential piece of himself. Or perhaps, Margaret thought, he had simply buried it deep enough that only love could excavate it. His last letters had been different, though shorter, filled with a quiet resignation that broke Margaret's heart. He had stopped talking about coming home and had started talking about duty, about the men he served with, about something called Operation Overlord that he couldn't discuss, but that filled him with a sense of immense gravity. "I'm where I need to be," he had written in August. "Whatever happens next, know that I'm exactly where I need to be." The summer of 1944 was brutally hot in Cleveland. Margaret worked double shifts at the ammunition factory, helping to produce the bullets and shells that she knew would be fired across some distant ocean. The irony was not lost on her. With each shell she packed, she wondered if she might be providing ammunition that would save her husband's life or end someone else's. The moral mathematics of war were impossible to solve. The news from Europe was increasingly grim. The D-Day landings in June had been savage. Margaret had listened to the radio reports with ice water in her veins, knowing that James's division had to be somewhere in that chaos. Normandy. She had looked it up on a map, this small corner of France that had become the epicenter of the world's suffering. She tried to imagine him there, but her mind couldn't construct the images. What was the point? No imagining could be worse than the reality. By August, the letters had nearly stopped coming. Margaret received one postcard that had been so heavily censored, it consisted of only 3 sentences. "Still thinking of you. The men are holding up well. Love, James." That was all. No date, no location, nothing that could tell her anything about his actual circumstances. She had memorized those 3 sentences, read them dozens of times, searching for hidden meaning in every word choice. In July, a woman from her church, Ruth Mitchell, had received notification that her son had been killed in action near a place called St. Lo. The funeral had been closed casket, with an empty box buried in the ground. Margaret had watched Ruth's face during the service and had seen what grief looked like when there was nowhere left to direct it. Ruth had aged years and weeks. Her hands shook constantly, and she would sit in church and stare at nothing, as if her soul had simply checked out of her body, leaving only the flesh behind. After the funeral, Ruth had taken Margaret's hand in a grip so tight it left marks. "Don't let yourself hope too much," Ruth had whispered. "It only makes it harder when the door closes." But Margaret couldn't live that way. She couldn't exist in a state of constant despair. She had 2 daughters who needed their mother present and whole, so she cultivated hope like a garden, nurturing it despite the evidence that nothing would ever be the same again. In September, the photograph had arrived, and everything had changed once more. Margaret showed the photograph to the women at the factory. Each one looked at it with that same expression, a mixture of admiration for James's smile and something darker, something like recognition. "He looks like a good man," one older woman named Dolores had said. "That's the smile a man gets when he's made peace with whatever's coming next." Again, that terrible intuition that seemed to follow the photograph like a shadow. Margaret had wanted to scream at them to stop, to not speak such dark words. But instead, she had simply collected the photograph and returned it to her pocket, held close to her heart. Her mother came to stay for a week in mid-September. She helped Margaret with the girls, mended clothes, and prepared meals from rationed ingredients. At night, they would sit in the living room, Margaret working on a sweater she was knitting for James, though she had stopped asking herself if he would ever wear it, while her mother read the newspaper aloud, her voice becoming quieter as she progressed through the casualty lists. James Sullivan, infantry sergeant, 29th Division, her mother read one evening, her voice barely above a whisper. Margaret's hands had frozen, but then her mother continued, wounded, status unknown. Margaret had felt the floor shift beneath her, and she realized with sudden clarity that she had been waiting for this moment, dreading it, preparing for it, all this time. The wound had already happened. The photograph had already been taken. Somewhere in the time between James's smile and Margaret's tears, the future had arrived. September 18th, 1944 was a Tuesday. Margaret had worked the night shift at the factory, and she was exhausted in the way that only wartime workers understood. Not just physically tired, but spiritually depleted, emotionally wrung out, existing in a state of perpetual half-sleep, where the boundary between dreams and reality had become negotiable. She had walked home as the sun rose, the world still cool but warming toward another hot day. The street was quiet except for the sound of a milk truck making its morning deliveries. Cleveland still felt like a working city, honest and earnest. But the war had changed it too. There were fewer men on the streets. More women wore uniforms. Children played with less joy somehow, as if even they understood that the world had broken open and was still trying to reassemble itself. The Western Union messenger was waiting on her porch. Margaret recognized him immediately. It was young Peter Kowalski, whose own father was somewhere in the Pacific. He looked as though he had aged years in the few months since she had last seen him. His eyes held the particular weight of delivering messages that destroyed worlds. "Mrs. Sullivan?" he asked, though he already knew who she was. She couldn't move. She stood at the bottom of the porch steps, gripping the railing, unable to make her legs carry her the final distance to where he stood. Peter descended the steps toward her, and she noticed his hand shaking as he extended the yellow envelope. In the morning light, it seemed to glow with a terrible luminescence. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Margaret took the envelope. It weighed nothing. It seemed impossible that something so light could contain so much weight. Her hands were shaking as she tore it open. The words swam before her eyes, and she had to read them several times before their meaning penetrated. "Deeply regret to inform you that your husband, Sergeant James Patrick Sullivan, was killed in action September 10th, 1944. Stop, the Secretary of War extends sympathy and condolences. Stop September 10th. The date of the photograph. The date of his smile." Margaret realized that when that photograph had been taken, James was already dead. Or rather, he was living in the final hours of his life, aware somehow that the end was coming. She could see it now in the clarity of his expression, in the way his arm held that young private. He was saying goodbye. He was teaching his men how to face the end with grace. Margaret's knees buckled. Peter caught her, guided her to the porch steps, and they sat together in silence while the morning grew warmer and the rest of Cleveland went about its day, unaware that a world had just ended on Elm Street. "When?" Margaret asked finally, her voice strange, hollow, as if it was coming from very far away. "The telegram says September 10th. That was 8 days ago," Peter said, and he looked as if he might cry himself. 8 days. She had been carrying around the knowledge of his death in the form of a photograph, and she hadn't even known. She had felt unsettled, uncertain, afraid. Her instincts had been screaming at her that something was wrong, but she had pushed it aside, told herself to be brave, told herself to have faith. And all the while, James had been dead. Her mother found her there an hour later, still clutching the telegram, staring at nothing. She had called Margaret from the factory to check in, and no one had answered. Sensing something was wrong, she had rushed over. When she arrived, Margaret was still sitting on the porch steps, her sweater half knitted on her lap, the yellow telegram in her rigid hand. The days that followed existed in Margaret's memory as a series of moments without clear sequence. She remembered telling her daughters. Catherine had cried. Emma had asked when Daddy was coming home, and Margaret hadn't been able to speak. She remembered visiting the funeral home and seeing a flag-draped coffin that held nothing of James. Because there was nothing left to hold, she remembered standing at the cemetery in cold November rain, watching that empty casket being lowered into the ground, and feeling absolutely nothing. She remembered thinking that she should be destroyed by grief, and yet she felt only a vast, echoing numbness. What she held on to, what kept her tethered to any semblance of sanity, was the photograph. She kept it on the nightstand beside her bed. Every morning, she woke and looked at that smile. Every evening before sleep, she held it to her heart. And every single time, she understood something new. James had known, in some way that transcended the ordinary mechanics of the world. James had known that this was his last photograph. This was his last smile. And he had smiled anyway. He had put his arm around that young private anyway. He had chosen to radiate love and strength into the world despite knowing, or perhaps because he knew, that his time was running out. 78 years later, Catherine Sullivan, now Catherine Brennan, a woman in her 80s with silver hair and still sharp eyes, held that photograph in her trembling hands. She was in a small museum in Washington, D.C., participating in a Veterans Day remembrance. The museum had asked her if they could display her father's photograph as part of their new exhibit on World War II soldiers. They wanted to tell his story. They wanted the world to know his name. Catherine had never met her father. She had only memories gathered from her mother's stories, a few letters he had written, and this single photograph. But those had been enough to construct a father in her heart. When she looked at the photograph, she didn't see a soldier. She saw the man her mother had loved. She saw the father who had promised to come home. She saw a human being who, in the face of unimaginable darkness, had chosen to smile. The exhibit had drawn thousands of visitors. Veterans came and wept. Children asked their grandparents about the soldiers they had known. Families traced the faces in photographs, hoping to find relatives, friends, neighbors. The museum director had told Catherine that more people asked about her father than about almost any other soldier in the collection. They wanted to know his story. They wanted to understand what lay behind that smile. Catherine had spent months researching, compiling letters, interviews with surviving soldiers who had known James, accounts of the final days before he was killed. She learned that September 10, 1944, was the day the 29th Infantry Division had launched an assault on a German position near St. Lo. In the brutal fighting that followed, Sergeant James Sullivan had led his men through machine gun fire and artillery barrages. He had been shot 3 times. He had still ordered his men forward, protecting them with his body even in the final moments before darkness claimed him. He had died thinking about his wife, thinking about his daughters, thinking about the life he would never live. The photograph had been taken that morning before the assault. One of the soldiers, Private Robert Chen, who survived the war and lived until 2003, had brought the camera he had won in a poker game. He had suggested taking photographs before the battle. Most soldiers had refused. They were superstitious. But James had smiled. He had gathered his men around him, and he had smiled like a man who had already forgiven himself and everyone else for the terrible things war required them to do. Catherine had located Private Chen's daughter through painstaking research, and she had contacted her. The woman, now 85 herself, had shared her father's memories. Robert Chen had never forgotten James Sullivan. In the chaos of combat, in the horrors of the European campaign, in all the years that followed, Robert had remembered that smile. He had told his daughter, "Your father's sergeant taught me how to die. He didn't die afraid. He died protecting us. He died smiling. I've tried to live the way he lived." Standing in the museum, Catherine understood something her mother had understood 78 years earlier. James's smile wasn't about happiness. It wasn't about ignorance of what was coming. It was about choice. In a world where so much is outside our control, where events larger than ourselves can sweep us away, James had chosen how to face the end. He had chosen love over fear. He had chosen to empower his men by showing them that even in the shadow of death, grace was possible. He had chosen to leave behind a smile that would outlive him, that would speak across decades to people he would never meet, reminding them that there was still light even in the darkness. Margaret had kept the photograph until her own death in 1987. In her will, she had asked that it be donated to a museum or historical society, so that James's smile could inspire others. Catherine had fulfilled that wish, and she had spent years tracking down the stories behind that single moment. She had discovered that her father's smile had saved lives. Not physically. Nothing could have changed the outcome of that battle. But spiritually, emotionally, psychologically. The men who served under James Sullivan had survived the war carrying with them the knowledge that they had served under a man of extraordinary character. That knowledge had sustained them through the decades that followed. Now, as Catherine stood before a glass case containing the photograph, surrounded by school groups and veterans and families who had come to remember, she felt her mother's presence. She felt her father's presence. She understood that love, real love, transcends death. It persists in photographs. It persists in stories told across generations. It persists in the choices we make to face our own darkness with courage and grace. "Thank you for coming," the museum director said, placing a hand on Catherine's shoulder. "Your father's photograph has meant more to visitors than I can express. People write us letters about it. They've told us that looking at his smile has changed how they think about sacrifice, about love, about what it means to be human." Catherine nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She turned back to the photograph one more time, her father's face frozen in that eternal moment. That smile, that incredible, devastating, redemptive smile. "He made a promise," Catherine said finally, her voice steady. "He promised to come home. And he did. He came home in this photograph. He comes home every time someone looks at it and chooses to see the love behind it instead of the loss." To everyone watching this story right now, whether you're here because you lost someone in war, or because you're searching for meaning in your own struggles, or simply because you wanted to understand what it means to face the end with grace, I ask you to carry James's smile with you. In your darkest moments, when you feel like giving up, remember that one man chose to smile anyway. He chose to love anyway. He chose to lead by example, to protect those weaker than himself, to face the unknown with courage. We all have moments like this coming. We all face our own battles, our own fears, our own final days, whether we know it or not. The question isn't whether we'll face them. The question is how we'll choose to face them. Will we face them with bitterness, with regret, with fear? Or will we face them the way James Sullivan did, with a smile that says, "I was here. I loved. I mattered." If this story has touched your heart, if my father's smile has spoken to something deep within you, please comment below and tell us what you're carrying with you right now. Share your own story of sacrifice, of love, of choosing grace in the face of darkness. And please subscribe so we can continue to tell the stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Because the world needs to remember. The world needs to know that there are people like James Sullivan. That there still are. That perhaps there's a bit of James in all of us, waiting for the moment when we need to smile anyway. Thank you for remembering. Thank you for caring. And thank you for being here with us as we honor those who gave everything.